We have another torso to investigate, again found in the River Thames, this time off Putney in 1874, so it's often called the Putney Torso. This case is often linked to the so-called Battersea Mystery, which was an early Thames Torso murder from September 1873, when 11 or 12 separate body parts were found scattered along the River Thames between Hammersmith, a short distance in that direction in the west, to Woolwich, 20 miles in the east. I conducted a thorough investigation into this case in a recent episode of the House of Lechmere, and if you want to refresh your memory, I'll provide a link in the description below. So what happened in this case? About 9 months after the Battersea Mystery, on the morning of Friday the 5th of June 1874, Robert Nichols, a labourer who lived in Fulham on the north bank of the River Thames, was out on his boat in the river when he saw something floating in the middle of the stream. He was opposite a development that was called the Cedars on the Putney side, which was where these houses were here now. The Cedars were two distinctive and quite grand terraces that faced onto the river on what was previously called Ranelagh Road, is now called Deodar Road. The District Line Railway was cut through them in 1889, and the buildings, which to say were quite grand, went into a state of disrepair, and they were knocked down in 1890 and are replaced by this terrace that's there now. Nichols realised it was the body of a woman, and he somehow brought it to the northern shore and found a policeman. It was reported the remains were in a shocking state of decomposition and consisted of the body without a head, shoulders, arms and one leg. Police Constable Ward borrowed an apron to cover the remains up and took them to the dead house. The next day, a surgeon, Mr. E.C. Barnes, examined the remains, which belonged to a female fully grown. The head, shoulders and arms were absent. The right leg to the knee was absent, and also the left foot. He could not give any opinion as to the age. This is a slightly different listing of missing body parts: both arms, right leg below the knee, left foot, head and shoulders. He found that the body was divided at the spinal column. 2 ribs were attached. The intestines were absent. I'm not sure what he meant by divided at the spinal column with 2 ribs attached. It seems to imply that the torso was cut open and the only internal organs that were listed as missing are the intestines. But quite unlike the Battersea torso, this time the body was in one big chunk, although bits had been cut off and presumably disposed of elsewhere. The parts appeared as if they had been cut off with a knife. He was of opinion that the remains had been decomposed in lime before they were placed in water. This again is unlike the Battersea torso, where a saw was liberally used alongside a knife. Furthermore, the culprit seems to have attempted to break the body down first by placing it in lime. To give you a better idea of where Robert Nichols found the body, it was close to where this District Line railway bridge crosses the river. This bridge wasn't there at the time. It opened in 1889 to coincide with the railway being cut through the Cedars, which I mentioned before. The bridge is colloquially known as the Fulham Railway Bridge, although it's sometimes called the Putney Railway Bridge or the Iron Bridge, but it hasn't actually got an official name, even though there's a plaque supposedly naming it. On a side note, what was Nichols, a labourer, doing rowing a boat in the river? How did he get a boat? How did he get the spare time to row the boat in the river? It doesn't match his profession. But this flies in the face of those later 21st century know-alls who claimed that labourers and people with fairly menial working class professions couldn't do things like row boats on rivers or have any spare time at all, perhaps even own a boat. These sorts of things were much more widespread in those days. Working class people used to attend music halls and pubs all the time. It was an age that liberated working class people from the usual drudgery of previous centuries. The current Putney Bridge opened in 1886. In 1874 there was a rickety wooden toll bridge about 50 yards further east, linking Putney High Street, which is where that opening is, where that person is on the foreshore is roughly, and went across to where the other opening is there, and the road curled around in front of the church and up Putney High Street, and there was a toll booth at either end. The old bridge was obviously demolished when this bridge was built. In 1874, on the line of this bridge, there was actually a metal aqueduct. On the western side of Putney Bridge, down here, this is actually where the university boat race starts. Boat race in Cockney rhyming saying, of course, means face. The famous rowing race between teams from Oxford and Cambridge universities. They head west in this direction, 4 miles, 374 yards to Mortlake. Although before the current course was set in stone, some races actually ended here. This side is what's known as the Middlesex station because it's on the Middlesex or Northern Bank, and that's Fulham. And the Putney side, this side, is what's known as the Surrey station. I often go on about a psychogeography of dislocation when one event after another happens in the same place, with each event over the years informing the later events. We've got quite a lot going on here. We've got the Bishop's Palace over here, the Bishop of London's Palace over there. We've got the boat race starting here. We've got that torso being found just over there. And just over here on the Putney Bank over there, on that embankment, that is where the serial killer, John Reginald Halliday Christie, was arrested on the 31st of March 1953. Christie was standing around there looking at some barges, some river boats in the river, and a policeman came up to him, thought he was a bit suspicious, asked him his name. Christie, guess what he did? He gave a false name, because that's what serial killers and criminals tend to do as a reflex when confronted by authority. He gave a false name. He gave his correct first name, John, and a second name, Whittington. At least that's how it was portrayed in the famous film 10 Rillington Place, with Richard Attenborough playing Christie. Very famous film, very famous serial killer. He gave that false name, although he had all his ID in his pockets. His subterfuge didn't last very long. The policeman recognised him. Christie's pictures had been all around the press. That's an interesting little sideline, isn't it? One other feature of this area, Putney, is of course where Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, one of the leading statesmen in English history, that's where he was born. And in case you're interested, I had a quick look on the foreshore here. We're a long way from central London. There's not a lot on mudlarking opportunities here by the looks of things. I found a couple of little bits of clay pipe though. The other main place of interest in this vicinity is Fulham Palace, the grand official residence of the Bishop of London, who at the time was called John Jackson and who is buried at All Saints Church in Fulham. Interestingly, during this period, Jackson was involved in a protracted dispute with a Church of England priest called Stuart Headlam. Headlam was heavily involved in social issues, and as a consequence, he was never promoted beyond being a curate, going from parish to parish until he could no longer even obtain that humble appointment, largely due to the opposition of Jackson, who was his bishop. From 1873 to 1878, Headlam was the curate at St Mathews, Bethnal Green, the church that hosted the funerals of the Cray twins. I filmed one of my films in the churchyard. I'll put a link up. Most clerics were from a solidly upper middle class background. Headlam, for example, went to Eton, and those who ministered in working class parishes tended to live in the posher neighbourhoods nearby, but Headlam chose to live amongst it on Wilmot Street near Bethnal Green tube station. Just behind the big Sainsbury's supermarket in Whitechapel, right by what was Bucks Row, is Headlam Street, which was named after him. In 1888 it was called Northampton Street. Headlam's an interesting character and a close friend of Oscar Wilde, and I'll come back to him in a future episode. The inquest was held at the Fulham Union Workhouse on the afternoon of Monday, the 8th of June 1874, and was over in one day. Fulham Workhouse became Fulham Hospital and is now Charing Cross Hospital, although it's not in Charing Cross, it's actually near Hammersmith. The original building was demolished. The coroner for West Middlesex was Thomas Brahma Diplock, who was quite an eminent doctor himself and was noted for being particularly conscientious. The jury was taken to view the body and were reportedly horrified by the spectacle before them. Dr. Barnes testified that he made a post-mortem examination after immersing the remains in Condy's fluid. There was nothing to show the cause of death. Condy's fluid was a disinfectant invented by an English chemist called Henry Bolliman Condy, a solution of alkaline manganetes and permanganates. When I was at school, potassium permanganate dominated chemistry lessons seemingly. His factory was actually in Battersea, just a little way west of Battersea Bridge, so it's a bit of a local product. Coincidentally, Condy's fluid seems to have been used by the culprit to mask the smell of the Whitehall Mystery body parts in 1888, one of the later Thames Torsos. In response to a question from a juror, Dr. Barnes said he did not think the remains had been used for anatomical purposes. The body was completely naked, apart from a small piece of linen attached to the leg, but PC Ward confirmed that this probably stuck to the body from the apron he had wrapped it in. And Inspector Wenham was in charge of the case on behalf of the police, and he confirmed that they had not been able to trace the identity of the body. How hard had they looked? The coroner said it was a case of grave suspicion, and as it was impossible to identify the remains, he thought no end would be gained by adjourning the inquiry. He recommended the jury to leave the case in the hands of the police. The jury then returned a verdict of found dead. There are no existing police records and effectively only one newspaper report, which was republished dozens of times around the country with slight variations, the odd word here or there, probably due to space constraints. Occasionally you find an extra sentence providing a small extra snippet of information. I've used the version printed in the Pall Mall Gazette under the headline "Another Thames Mystery," referencing the Battersea Mystery. It's often said that the Putney Torso was linked to the Battersea Mystery, but the only link is that headline. The 1874 torso is quite unlike the 1873 case, which caused a sensation in the press over several weeks. In 1873, the inquest itself was spread over 2 days. Scotland Yard took charge of the case. A £200 reward was offered. Multiple leads were followed up involving Kent and Dorset police, for example, and it led to a degree of moralising and hand-wringing with which we associate the Victorian era. The contrast between the two cases seems quite strange. I think the main reason why the 1874 torso was so poorly reported on and investigated was because there wasn't any dramatic tension. As the body was found in one piece and so in one location, there couldn't be any gruesome updates as each new part was found. It lacked that narrative flow. I think this led to less newspaper interest and also adversely affected the police's interest in the case as well. Although, as I've said before, when a body is divided into too many pieces, human nature being what it is, the press and the police lose interest. If there's too many bits, they just lose interest in the later pieces. There's probably a happy medium. So in this case, there was no reward offered. There was effectively only one newspaper report and virtually no attempt by the police to find the culprit. I also suspect that the police's failure to find the culprit in the 1873 case led them to take less interest in the 1874 case. Was it by the same hand? It seems to me that it wasn't. Bits were cut off for some reason, but most of the body was deposited in one big chunk in the river, logically reasonably close to where it was found, as transporting a large decomposing lime-covered torso any sort of distance would have been difficult. Unlike the other torsos, this one was coated in lime in an attempt to decompose and destroy the body before it was put in the river. Incidentally, I feel the body can't have been in the river very long because the water, the river of the water and the flow of the water over the body would have erased the evidence of those lime deposits. And also, if it had been in the river for any length of time, I'm sure it would have been noticed sooner. There's no evidence that a saw was used to cut up this body, unlike in the 1873 case. So to me, it doesn't look like this case is related to the other torsos I've discussed. This means, of course, that I don't think Lechmere could have been responsible, a conclusion which might surprise some cynics. When I first went into this case, I thought he would have been responsible for it, but the facts tell me something different. I can't see him storing a body, coating it in lime, and then transporting a decomposing corpse all the way across London to Putney in the back of his cart, with presumably other produce disguising it on top. I think the victim must have been killed, stored and dismembered locally and put in the river reasonably close to where it was found. I'll briefly consider the where and how of these murders. To paraphrase Voltaire, don't let perfection stand in the way of progress, which might be a slightly inappropriate way of referring to this matter. In discussions I've had, it's been suggested to me that the culprit would need to hang the body upside down by their feet over a drain so that the blood could drain away neatly and then the body could be dismembered without much mess. I'd suggest that in the real world of murder and serial killing, this sort of thing seldom, if ever, happens. It's much more haphazard. Think of Dennis Nielsen, who murdered at least 12 men in various premises that he lived in North London 40 years ago, where he cut them up without draining their blood and disposed of the pieces in a variety of ways. All that's required are secure premises, which could be a shed or stable, where the culprit wouldn't be disturbed. Unless those premises were closely examined, no one would be any the wiser. The living accommodation on a barge, however, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, was very small, cramped and impractical for dismemberment, in my opinion. One thing I will say, I don't believe that in any of these torso cases the body parts were thrown off the bridge. I'll come to that conclusion because nearly every one of these bridges had toll booths on either end, and there were toll collectors there, and it would have made the person who did it stop halfway across and chucking something in the river very conspicuous. So I think it's almost certainly the case they were dropped from the riverbank at high tide, so there wasn't such a big drop, into the river. What of the connection to Fulham Palace? Could the Bishop of London have been responsible, or Stuart Headlam? Maybe he planted the corpse to embarrass Jackson, or maybe it was the work of one of the Fulham Palace flunkies. Maybe they crept up to the bank of the river just over there and rolled the corpse in at high tide, after storing it perhaps in one of the vaults in the palace. Or should I try and construct a connection between Lechmere, Headlam and Jackson, based around Headlam's East End curacy? If nothing else, I hope this will provide a fertile field for a work of fiction by an enterprising writer, and if someone takes me up on this, I hope to get some commission out of it. So we've got the so-called Fulham Railway Bridge. That's roughly where the body was found, floating in the middle of the river there. We're on the line, the old Putney Bridge, the old wooden Putney Bridge which was demolished. There's the new Putney Bridge, and just on the other side of the new Putney Bridge, that's where the boat race starts. Now, believe me, this film has been much easier to film than the one on the 1873 case, with all those different locations where all those different body parts were found. One location, one body part. I'm tempted to ask why all the torso cases can't be this simple. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, share and like, and comment below. Do you agree with my conclusions?